Thank you everyone for attending. I hope people can hear me online. If not, please feel free to unmute or leave in the chat a little message, but we've checked in. I think everyone can hear us, so that's great. So thank you everyone for being here. I'm Hema. I helped co-organize this seminar today. And so we're very excited to have two scholars and activists actually. So they kind of straddle these two roles among multiple other roles I'm sure that they do in this work. And they're going to be talking to us about their perspectives on violent and non-violent resistance strategies. And so you may know this from attending maybe past PEPSS seminars that we kind of have it structured so that both speakers speak first and then they kind of speak to each other. So it's a little bit to encourage dialogue across disciplines. And so Stellan comes from a sociological background. Robin is a bit interdisciplinary, right? Is that right? So more psychology and communication studies as well. So that's lots of exciting and rich theoretical perspectives that they'll share with us today. So first up, I think we're going to be having Professor Stellan Windhagen, and then we will go with Dr. Robin Gulliver. So let me just do an introduction for Stellan here.
And the acknowledgement.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Before I get started, though, I want to do an acknowledgement of country. So I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay our respects to their ancestors and descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. And also take a moment to remember that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and will be Aboriginal land. All right, so just a quick note that this presentation is being recorded. So we like to amplify kind of the reach of these lovely presentations. We will record them and put them online on the Social Change Lab website. So just make note of that in case you have a preference not to be recorded.
All right.
Let me go back to the intro page while I introduce our first speaker. All right. So first of all, we have Professor Stellan Windhagen. He's a professor of sociology and a scholar activist. Windhagen is the inaugural endowed chair in the study of nonviolent direct action and civil resistance, and also the director of the Resistance Studies Initiative at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the US. He is also a researcher in his native Sweden at the Department of Social and Behavioral Studies, University West, and at the School of Global Studies in the University of Gothenburg, where he is leading the Resistance Studies program. He is an academic advisor to the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict with a PhD in Peace and Development Research from the University of Gothenburg in 2005. Now he's going to be talking to us about his perspective, and he has kind of different disciplinary norms. Typically, we're quite used to having presentation slides, but he's actually going to give us a talk without these slides. So you have to pay attention much closely, I think, to things that he's sharing, and kind of to be able to see him on full screen with all his glory. I will stop sharing so that you can see him over here, and I'll maybe pin it in some way. All right. Thank you, Stellan. You're welcome to start when you're ready.
Thank you so much, Emma. Okay, so my talk will focus on what social science claims about resistance. And it's actually going to be a transdisciplinary perspective, since I kind of come from peace and development studies, but I work in sociology right now. And basically, I want to outline for you the understanding of resistance within social science, which comes from many different disciplines, and argue that the main research that exists in the area is around terrorism and protest. But I'm going to highlight a number of other more interesting forms of resistance that I think contains more promising possibilities for impact in future. And firstly, maybe I should say something about what's meant with resistance in my understanding. So I use the concept in the way that it's very broad, as a subaltern practice that might undermine domination, That meaning that it comes from below. There is someone that is subordinated in a hierarchy that is doing some form of practice that has a possibility of undermining that relationship of domination. So that means that resistance can show up in many different places, in many different ways. And it's actually a common part of social interactions that we find in our relationships in the family as well as in international politics. And the theory frameworks that resistance are studied with are organized along a spectrum of more or less importance of structure, complexity, or agency and strategy. And research in the area approaches varies also very much between quantitative and qualitative methodology. So in order to kind of upfront kind of lift up what are the main findings in the resistance studies field, I would say that there are 5 major things that I want to kind of lay out here for you. Number 1 is that social movement mobilizations are growing globally. Number 2, that mass-based, disruptive civil resistance is the most impactful strategy. Number 3 is that violent flanks and riots might be impactful, but it's unclear research results so far. We are not really clear how they are impacting. Number 4 is that terrorism leads almost invariably to increased militarization, surveillance, and authoritarianism. So it's very hard to see how it has any kind of impact. And number 5 is that subtle, soft, kind of more subtle, everyday forms of resistance exist in almost all subordinated groups in all societies and can in some situations develop accumulated and significant impact, although it's very hard to measure. That's kind of the main kind of claims that I'm going to argue. But as I said, I'm going to highlight a number of resistance strategies that are less researched, that I myself are more interested in, and that I think are more promising for the future. All right. So contemporary research within social science, mainly within international relations, anthropology, sociology, peace and conflict studies, and political science on resistance is dominated by 2 areas. The study of terrorism, which means then non-state armed warfare and attacks on civilians. And secondly, collective public unarmed forms of protest or contentious politics, as what we see in social movements, mobilizations of large-scale collective unarmed claims making, contentious actions such as demonstrations, riots, blockades, civil disobedience, strikes, and boycotts. So these are the 2 areas where most of the efforts in terms of research goes. So let's take them one by one here. The terrorism research is unfortunately dominated by a mainstream state-oriented national security, repressive and militarist research. And that's why critical studies of terrorism is a reaction to this kind of mainstream view on terrorism. Historically, studies of guerrilla warfare was important to understand the anti-colonial movements, but today all that is reframed in a state-oriented way as forms of counterinsurgency. The field provides risk assessments, profiling, surveillance technology, multidimensional prevention measures, etc. All of it serving the interests of the state and its national security interests. In this meaning, terrorism research is not really studies of resistance, I would say, but how to repress resistance. Studies of protest, on the other hand, or contentious politics are mainly done within social movement studies and studies of civil society These are the kind of big fields within sociology, for example, where I work now. When you go to a conference on sociology, social movement studies tends to be the main kind of area. But there is also a field of civil resistance studies, which is an emerging field that has come up the last decade. There's a lot of specialized theories on movements focused on frameworks such as identity, resources, opportunities, framing, frustrations, emotions, etc. So social movement studies is mostly preoccupied in understanding why movements appear, what they say about the dominant society and the modernism of our types of societies, and how they maintain their mobilization, much more than what impact they have or what they could be doing to be stronger, which would be more interesting if you're an activist. So a lot of that research is not particularly relevant for activists. Civil resistance studies, on the other hand, is much more useful directly for activists and has been picked up by a lot of movements in later years, because that is focused more on the particular tactics and strategies of resistance campaigns. And the main strand of contemporary research is quantitative and has emerged very strongly in then the last decade. So a growing interest exists also for something that is much more hard to research, which is called everyday forms of resistance. Here we're talking about hidden or disguised forms of resistance done by individuals or small groups spontaneously or when opportunities show up, as well as prefigurative politics, the creation of alternative political institutions and organizing. And that is a field that I have myself spent some time in trying to understand, and I can say more about later in discussions. But there's very little of empirical case studies of research that exist on constructive resistance, which is my latest book that came out in September, which is dealing with that, which I think is much more a promising form of resistance. There have been some conceptual and theoretical work on autonomous or exilic communities in forms of self-governance and delinking from society. You might know from historical studies of the work around maroon societies, which is escaped slaves that from the beginning of colonialism, where people escaped very often by individuals and families in the beginning, but forming communities of up to several thousands of people living in exile from slave societies, forming their own free societies up in mountains or in swamps or in other less accessible areas. That's an example of that. There are also forms of decolonizing resistance or queer resistance that has paid some interest in research. Historically, there's also been a strong interest for revolutions within historical sociology, but not much anymore, which is kind of ironic since we see more revolutions today than we have seen historically. So there is a lot of problems within where the emphasis and the efforts of research, where it's going. I think it's kind of skewed in a way towards what is more obvious resistance, like protest, on mass protest on the streets, and terrorism. So on a fundamental level, when it comes to the research findings from this broader field of research on resistance, the research shows that resistance is a very varied phenomenon with at least 9 different main types, something that I can outline if you're interested in later on in discussions. Another thing that has been clear in the research is that resistance is not an exception or extreme example in just some occasions, but it's part of the social interactions of normal life. And that resistance exists basically always where domination forms relationships of subordination in society. So if we think about subordination in terms of race, sexuality, class, or anything else, you would find also resistance. All kinds of groups, cultures, and contexts might be utilizing resistance, although those that have lived for generations under repressive domination develop more of it. So we will find more of resistance developed in cultures like in Palestine, in Kurdistan, and in these other places, and among indigenous people. But they exist all over, among migrants, among prisoners, and for those of you that have kids, you would know that resistance is very common among teenagers against their parents. So, when it comes to the general findings, and there are a lot of more details to say about what kind of results we see in the field, of course, but just in order to have some broad description here, we can say that movement mobilizations are increasingly growing to historical records levels globally. We have never seen so much of large mobilizations of resistance movements as we see now. So like, for example, in 2019, before the pandemic, there were some 30 plus mobilizations around in different countries in the world, from Iraq to Argentina and Greece and Spain and United States, where we saw some of the biggest mobilizations ever when it comes to United States around Black Lives Matter, for example. Secondly, we have this fact that mass-based disruptive civil resistance, meaning unarmed resistance that is disruptive in a way that it breaks rules, it's disobey in some way, and it's mass participation of ordinary people, is clearly the most impactful strategy that is able to create regime change, even against authoritarian militarized regimes. Research has shown that it is double as effective in overthrowing a militarized authoritarian regime when you compare the different examples way back in 100 years, looking at all kinds of violent campaigns and unarmed campaigns. You find that the unarmed mass mobilizations of disruptive populations are much more effective in overthrowing regimes, double as effective as armed ones. Many people believe that you need to have arms in order to deal with militarized regimes. If we look at places like Iran or in Russia or so, and they are certainly not easy to deal with. But historically and through the research, it's very clear it is the unarmed mass movements that are the most effective. Particularly if we're interested in a result that is not overthrowing, not just overthrowing the regime, but actually also creating an outcome of a more democratized society, and a society that don't end up in a civil war, then the unarmed means are even much more effective, up to 10 times more effective than armed means, because armed means tend to produce new forms of dictatorships. And then, as I said before, violent flanks, meaning armed groups acting as additions to larger unarmed movements, or riots, which means unarmed violence by crowds, might be impactful in connection to these mass-based civil resistance movements. There are some indications of that. There are also some indications that they undermine the logic of unarmed movements. But here, the results are inconclusive, so we don't really know for sure. However, it seems very clear when we look at the research on terrorism that it doesn't produce the results that people are aiming for. There's another thing that terrorism is produced all the time by people being desperate and being in very difficult situations. So there are reasons to understand why terrorism is happening. But it doesn't seem to be very impactful. And then these subtle everyday forms of resistance is something that has its own kind of interest in a number of different disciplines, from peasant studies to migrant studies and studies of prison populations and so on. Where it becomes clear that people are adopting a form of resistance that is hiding itself from being detected as resistance. So this form of everyday forms of resistance is particular in the way that people are pretending to not understand the rules, are doing fake forms of misunderstandings, are working slow when they're not under surveillance, are stealing from their workplace, or in other ways undermining the logic of the system where they are part of, but they pretend to be obedient workers or citizens. So it's a form of hidden and disguised resistance that hides itself. And that form of resistance, I think, is particularly interesting, particularly when it becomes more developed and more widespread, as we see in something which is called resistance cultures. If you have been interested in looking into the Palestinian resistance against the occupation in Palestine before the situation that we see today of the ongoing genocide, what has been going on in the occupied territories has been described as a form of life as resistance, where people are resisting in so many different ways by disobeying and undermining the everyday logic of the occupation. We also see that among the Kurds. We see that among a lot of other people that develop resistance cultures of these forms of hidden, disguised resistance, that when a lot of people are doing it, can be extremely impactful. So, for example, the work by Asef Bayat in looking into slum dwellers in big urban cities in the global south has shown that when people are creating the informal areas of shack dwellings in Cairo and in Nairobi and in Tehran and so on, they are so massive and so many in doing their form of encroachment on the city and its city planning, that it's virtually impossible for the city planners to repress them. So they might send the riot police to evict people from slum areas, but then they will turn up somewhere else. So if you look on city planning over decades, you can see how it is actually this form of everyday resistance from poor people that is dominating the cities. And they are a factor that people that run the cities in formal positions have to accommodate to and follow their lead. So what I'm arguing here is that what we see is that among slum dwellers, enslaved populations, indigenous communities, migrants, prison populations, low-paid manual jobs, and so on, there is a massive resistance that is more individualized, that is not happening through that people go on the street with their banners and shouting their demands, but they are doing resistance all the time in their everyday life. And that kind of resistance is something that is very hard to measure, research, and so, but we can see the impact, the effects of it. So when it comes to the different theoretical frameworks and methodological approaches in the field, as I said, we can find both quantitative and qualitative approaches within the social movement studies and civil resistance studies, indigenous studies, revolution studies, queer studies, terrorism studies, and war studies. We find so many different forms of theoretical perspectives. So sometimes it's hard to kind of see the links between these different fields and how to understand it all as an overarching research on resistance as such. Unfortunately, there is not so much of communication between these different fields in a way that makes it harder to formulate these more general conclusions. My critical assessment of the existing research and findings, which is what I'm going to end here my overview with, is that I have a couple of points that I think there are some key political ethical problems with the research, since the research tend to be either state-serving adjustments, as we see with terrorism studies, or state-critical reform orientations, as we see within social movement studies, where researchers take the contemporary world order as given or as the best possible option. In these fields, we find assumptions of that are realist, perhaps critical or liberal versions, but they all take the capitalism, the imperialism, and the liberal democracy, the nation states, etc., as given. Unavoidable real facts, which is only possible to reform or so, not to replace. And I think that kind of framework is making it harder to see the more novel and interesting forms of resistance that is actually trying to abolish capitalism and the nation state and the kind of world order that we have today, which kind of leads us to some key knowledge problems within the research. And I think we tend to have academic discussions and framework and research problems and concepts that tends to be divorced from the everyday realities and the strategic dilemmas and survival needs of resistance movements. We kind of have, if you want, an academic field that is kind of married to an old world order that is on the way being breaking down. So, for example, the social movement studies are preoccupied with how collective identities are formed, how movements manage their organizational structures, etc. And civil resistance studies are focused on either single case studies or large database studies that produce quantitative claims that can prove the superior impact of peaceful means and strategies. But the problem is that statistics shows only general patterns, not what to do in specific context and how to relate to ongoing dynamics in a complex struggle. And case studies only interpret what might explain that resistance worked in a particular context after the fact, post-conflict. So in that way, much of the academic work is kind of ironically not very useful for activists. And I think that's a real problem. And this has led to an overemphasis on finding the key factors that explain regime change, authoritarian militarized regimes, autocracies or dictatorships, where success, in quotation mark, is seen as the establishment of liberal democracy and avoidance of civil war, where, for example, Egypt, Tunisia, South Africa, Philippines are seen as successful. But each of these cases can be looked at more carefully, and you can find that they have actually not changed very much of the realities for the ordinary people. This is maintained as the key research area of civil resistance studies, despite that the success rate is decreasing since over 1 decade. Due to ritualistic inflation of certain tactics, as for example, occupation of public squares or mass demonstrations in major cities, and due to the learning curve of autocrats, where people like Putin are learning how civil resistance works and are able to deal with it and undermine it. And also that they are successful in the way or we understand them as successful, tend to later become neoliberal societies, as for example, South Africa. South Africa is actually today more economically unequal, despite the overthrow of the apartheid regime, which was undoubtedly a success, you could say. But economically speaking, for ordinary people, South Africa is more unequal today than it was during apartheid. And that must be seen as a failure of a more deep-rooted social change, and something that we should pay interest to. Or we see how new authoritarian regimes raise up after the revolution, like in Egypt, that creates a situation that is even worse than before. Or we see a decrease of the democratization, as for example in Tunisia, with a more corrupt elite taking over the liberal democracy. So what is then the way forward? And here I have a proposal to end with. And that is that I think we need research that is oriented in a different way, mainly 2 ways. I think we need systematic, qualitative, comparative case studies of different forms of resistance, as with QCA, qualitative comparative analysis, with process tracing, etc., and more problem-oriented, context-related collaborations between activist scholars and experienced activists, those that I would prefer to call the professors of the street. They have a hands-on practical organizing knowledge on how to do things, so we could have then a collaboration between the professors of the academia and the professors of the street in future research projects. And I would suggest that the most under-researched, but also the most potentially impactful strategy for successful liberation is constructive resistance among local communities that develop self-governance, self-organizing, and transversal relations with other communities, like the Zapatistas, the landless workers in Brazil, the Kurds, etc., where they create their alternatives, which is the constructive part, the yes, the part which is kind of envisioning and embodying the future society, while they at the same time resist the old society. That is a much more productive and hopeful path for resistance, I think, than just the protest, because the protest is trying to just overthrow and get rid of some particular regime that is repressive right now, but is having a big question mark of where to go after the overthrow of the regime. Whereas the constructive resistance is the fertile ground for the emergence of a new society. So we need further development of a specialized interdisciplinary research field that critically compare different types of resistance in a variation of contexts. And that would, in my view, be more qualified to call a resistance studies, not something what we see today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stellan. Hope you could hear the claps in the room and also the virtual claps online. So we are going to save questions from the audience members to the end, but we'll get started on the next talk now. So I'd love to welcome Dr. Robin Gulliver. So let me just do a quick introduction here. Before that, might work if I shared your screen. Hope people online are able to see. Look, all right. So Dr. Robin Gulliver is an honorary research fellow at the University of Queensland. She is a multi-award-winning environmentalist, writer, and researcher who has served as an organizer and leader of numerous environmental organizations. Her research focuses on the antecedents and consequences of environmental activism, and her current major project is the Movement Monitor, undertaken through the Commons Social Change Library, which seeks to measure the impact of Australian climate movements. All right, without any further ado, we have Dr. Robin Gulliver.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me if I speak at this volume? Great. I'm going to talk today for about 15 minutes. I'm just going to put my clock on. So first of all, thank you very much for having me talk today. I am going to hopefully follow very, very well on from Stellan's talk because I don't have a whole lot of theory, but geez, I've got a whole lot of data. And so today I'm going to show you a whole lot of data about civil resistance, direct action, activism, advocacy, whatever we want to call it, collective action. Before I start, I just do want to mention that if you see anything in the talk today that looks interesting or you go, wow, it probably originated from my PhD supervisors, Professor Wilfred Lewis or Professor Kelly Fielding, or from other people who are doing great work in this area like as well. So thank you to those. Okay, so I've got basically 7 topics I'm going to run through. It's a bit of a mishmash. Like I said, it's a whole lot of data, and mainly the point of this is to compare the data and the analysis I've done on Hong Kong pro-democracy movement with the data I have on the Australian environmental and climate movement. So just going to race through those things. There you go. Okay, first thing I want to point out is that the data sets are different. It's really important when we're talking about civil resistance or activism to clarify whether we're talking about individual choices to engage in activity or not, or the group dynamics which determine whether those activities actually go ahead, and often what the response from the state or the media or corporations is. So first of all, when I'm talking about everything in this presentation, it's a total mishmash of data from Hong Kong, which is very much individual intentions to engage in collective action and past participation. We had some longitudinal data. We have a bunch of interviews with people who have various different perspectives, so bystanders and journalists, etc. And then we had some one-off surveys and experiments as well, versus work I've done on Oceania with Winifred and Kelly as well, which is very much group-based. We do have a lot of data on individual determinants of intention to engage in collective action, but it's primarily what I look at is why groups do certain things under certain contexts and what the responses of those other actors is to that. So bear that in mind. The first thing, how prevalent is it? When we possibly think of Hong Kong, we think it was a highly prevalent, right? It really made the news for a long period of time, right up to the introduction of national security laws in 2020. We've probably all got visions in your head now, right? Those really famous protests of people halfway through throwing a petrol bomb, the police chase down the streets, be like water. What we found in our data, though, is actually by and large, nobody wanted to engage in violent action. We'll talk about later about how this might have happened, but most people didn't agree with it at all. What they did support was supporting those who were prepared to engage in defensive violent action. So if the police were coming at them and they were going to arrest them and do knows who not what afterwards, they were prepared to help those people hold their ground. And it's a really important distinction to make because it looks violent. From the outside, it looks like everybody is doing terrible, violent things, but actually people making really subtle choices about what they will and will not engage in. So the violence, by and large, from 2014 umbrella movement, it kind of escalated to the point where you couldn't tell who was doing what, but the most overt parts of it was by the instruments of the state. In Australia, Very few people support violence against objects, against property, even defensive violence, perhaps. And I have spent lots of time looking at groups and what they do. Very, very little evidence that anybody would actually, first of all, openly state that they will engage in violence and actually do it. So that sets the scene. It doesn't happen very often. So, got some quotes from our interview studies here. These are quotes on this page from Hong Kong. So first of all, one protest participant, we interviewed 35 people at the 2 million people march, asked them what do they think about the use of violence. One person has this very pragmatic approach, I suppose, about violence, that if you're going to fight, you're going to bleed. And the next person has a very principled approach to violence, that it's wrong, it's morally wrong, we will not engage in it under any circumstances. The third one, this is a bystander, and this interview was done in 2018, so before things got really, really violent. This bystander said, when I saw the behaviours of some protesters on the news, I did not support them because I think what I'd seen was really extreme. They were really throwing things everywhere, directly attacking the police, but I didn't see why. This was not really a movement or a demonstration, it was a riot. And of course, this is one of the biggest points that people make when you seem to engage in violence as a protester, is that you alienate the other people who might join you. But it's also worth noticing after this that millions of people in Hong Kong participated in those demonstrations after this interview as well. So yes, might alienate some of the public, but also whether that is a measurable and statistically significant negative effect is debatable to me. And then this is, last quote is supporting what I was saying earlier, that people are prepared to support. So this protest participant said, although I think radical non-peaceful action is useful, I'm not ready to participate, but I would back up others, like delivering necessities. I would not be at the front line and support them. So it was really common. I think maybe 17 out of the 35 people we interviewed said that. So this was from the second wave of a longitudinal study. We asked people how likely they were to engage in it in the future in these various actions. And this was before the introduction of the national security law, before it was really clear that that law was going to be introduced as well. So you can see on the scale 1 to 7, it was very unlikely to very likely. People, it was only 1.49 or something mean of intention to burn off. So it's low, but it's not like non-existent. So definitely people willing to do it. But if you look at the non-violent things that people are prepared to do, let's say the conventional actions, that privately forwarding information to others is the most common. So it'd be pretty obvious why, right? There's not going to be possibly repercussions. So this is the escalatory violence, and I know Winifred's done a lot of work on this kind of cycle of radicalisation, right? And I've just picked these quotes because I feel like they really encapsulate that cycle happening. So this first one was a protest participant. Sometimes protesters are left with no choice, and they do these kinds of actions when facing this totalitarian government. But I hope the police can control themselves. They're public servants, these are unarmed students, and it's not necessarily force them or shoot them. A journalist then said in an interview, some people on the scene demanded that the police should not use excessive force. But the commander responded, if the protesters do not use force, neither would we. At that moment, protesters pushed forward to their front line, and the commander said, look at them, how can we not use force? Protest participants said, it's not us who clash with the government, but the operation of the police force is more radical. So I think it's self-defence. So this is defensive violence. I'm just doing it because you did it to me first. And then the last one here is a thing about efficacy that some protesters told us as well. The reason why it escalates to be more violent in nature is that Hong Kong people have tried joining rallies, peaceful attitude. Then they realised that actually the government wouldn't change. So after that, they escalate. Hong Kong people also want to know under what condition the government will respond to us. That's obviously clear now, but it wasn't clear then. But that also means let's just keep doing this and see how far we can go. Right, my last slide of quotes is about Australia. So this quote here is from someone who was arrested last year in a blockade, and it kind of, I'll just read it through, and then there was something that happened afterwards I'll explain as well. I was the last to be taken from the van, so he's been charged. He's been taken to the watch house, The sergeant had a grip on my upper arm. It was unnecessarily firm. We neared the row of chairs. He pushed me and I stumbled and I turned to the sergeant and stupidly said, "Don't fucking push me. You try to push you as much as I want to fucking push you." So he shoved me in the chest, but I stumbled back onto the chair. Processing took a further hour and each stage I was the last. But it was evident that a senior sergeant was ensuring the cop who pushed me had no further contact with me. This happened because you can't take any videoing equipment when you're arrested, right? So it's hidden. You can't see it. But there was some kind of check and balance above that sergeant that stopped it from escalating. And then he said later as well, this protest participant, just because I act non-violently doesn't mean the police will respond similarly. Indeed, there's been incidences where police consider passivity a provocation. Police expect violence and they see it everywhere. When push came to shove, adrenaline kicked in for me and with it aggression. What happened afterwards was that the other great number of people who got arrested actually started singing a non-violent protest anthem that I've completely forgot the name of, but in a way to reassert that norm of non-violence, and it calmed them down. Right, now this is a dump about why some contexts, Hong Kong versus Australia, might be more likely to either support defensive non-violent violence or violence in general. I'm just going to race through them and then you can think about it and work out all the ways that I'm wrong. So the first one, a really big, I think, the biggest determinant about whether a person chooses to use non-violence is whether the power of the state to silence dissent, particularly whether that power is indiscriminate and it's unaccountable and it's also unable to be viewed or seen by others. So this is why I'm particularly worried about surveillance as well. Why else might people choose to be violent or non-violent? I believe also in groups, because this is very much group-based. Collective action is a group-based activity. There's a really strong norm against it in Australia. Now, people can join a group, or they could see themselves as an individual activists and act alone. But, you know, you can't do a rally with one person, right? It's just a walk down the street. So you really need a lot of people in your group to do an action. When you join a group, when you identify as an activist, you take on the weight of the history behind you. Whether you know you're doing it or not, it dampens down those violent impulses. Personal calculations of risk is a really big one. Here, in any environmental group you're in, when you're talking about actions, people often say, you know, I have caring needs, I have people I need to care for, I have a job, I work for the state, I can't do this. Risk is very, very important, even when that risk is not very big. Issue immediacy. What's different about the national security laws in Hong Kong versus what's different about climate change in Australia? I think, you know, it continually astonishes me that we go about our business, me too, every day like everything's normal, but we're in this massive climate crisis. It's just not in my face, right? Whereas if I was in Hong Kong and I knew I was going to be directly affected, I'm going to lose my rights to speak in public about things I care about, maybe it makes the grievance more immediate and your actions more immediate. Group structures, again, we have these kind of norms, the history. The more established and institutionalised a group is, the less likely it is to me that they would then advocate for violence, and also the likelihood of favourable state or active responses, so it's efficacy. I think Alan talked about that a lot as well. It's a bit hard today in Australia to know whether violent action is efficacious because we actually don't have many indications of it in the past to measure it against, right? But in general, people would probably, I'm making an assumption here, say that you are going to get squashed immediately if you do anything violent, and you are also probably going to destroy your group at the same time. So maybe don't do it. Right, racing through these last slides. So this is just a point on the slide to show how minor, or what a minority of actions are in Australia that actually involve what we might call civil resistance or direct action, and then what a tiny proportion of that might be disruptive or illegal. And of course, then none, very few are violent. So the non-violent action over the year is 17,000 out of 81,000 events that we have in our database at the moment. And of those non-violent actions, probably 1% of those are blockades or sit-ins. Now, you could say that groups might not advertise blockades or sit-ins, so that's why we don't know about it. But actually, they really do, because they need to get people on their cause. Rising Tide, November this year, blasted everywhere. You can go and join that blockade if you want. So those types of actions are very, very seldom. Now I'm going to go through very quickly data we have on how these other actors respond to activism. And this is generally only in Australia. This is the Australian data. First thing, corporate responses. So we have a big project started under Winifred and Kelly. We were tracking all of the campaigns that we can find in the Australian environmental movement, and there's a lot, and we work out whether the goal and the target of that campaign actually was achieved. Now, you cannot claim causation between what a campaign wants to achieve and whether it is achieved, but when you're getting up to thousands of campaigns, the theory is that we can see some patterns. We can definitely see that corporations do respond. So businesses up there, there's 15 of the roughly, 60 or 70 campaigns were partially successful. So it might be a divestment campaign where they've asked lots of banks to divest and maybe one of them did. And then 21 of them actually were successful. Corporations, I think, are the easiest actor to sway from a campaign. Political stuff's a little bit harder, but even so, 102 of those campaigns had a successful outcome. Again, you can't claim it's because of the campaign, but it's still positive. Public responses to resistance. The busy slide, I apologise, but on the right-hand side is an essential report back in 2019 when the Extinction Rebellion protests came up, and they asked how many people support it. And by voting intention, it's quite different, right? So the Labor voters, 68% of them supported Extinction Rebellion tactical choices, whereas Coalition, 27% supported, which still is pretty high for coalition supporters. On the over here on this graph is how people view global warming over time. Big dip, but it's gone up. And 2018 was before Extinction Rebellion, but we're still talking about years and years of activism here from the climate movement for that. And then up the top is some work from a thing called Climate Compass, which splits people into how they view climate change and then whether they would engage in non-violent direct action. And you can see that of the people who are alarmed, 37% of them might engage in non-violent direct action, which to me is a really high percentage because in real life, maybe 1 out of thousands it feels like, would actually do that. State responses to resistance. So there's a whole bunch of responses they can have, and the worst one for an activist probably is that they get ignored, and that happens the most. But what we're seeing a lot now is being attacked through criminalisation. That's not new. This data here on the screen goes back to 2016 when we looked at how many activists were being arrested. It's only reported in the media. It's almost impossible to get that data. And you can see that different parts of legislation, that's the numbers, different states bringing in legislation, pretty consistent. There were a lot of them that wanted to do stuff after Extinction Rebellion came out. It's quietened down a wee bit now, but we've still had some new laws brought in recently. Had activists in Sydney jailed for 3 weeks, for example. So this is a big problem. And media responsive. This is analysis of about 40,000 media articles back in 2019 when School Strike for Climate were doing their strikes and Extinction Rebellion was doing their Rebellion Week. And so both forms of disruptive, non-violent civil resistance. The colours, the blue means it was negative. It's a bit hard on the side there, but Extinction Rebellion, those are the media outlets. And the size of the circle was how much the media outlet talked about them. So you see news.com were pretty obsessed with Extinction Rebellion. And when you look at School Strike for Climate, they had far more neutral coverage, very little. The red is positive, the neutral's better. So it's interesting, these narratives flow through to the public and affect how the public see these protests as well. So I'm nearly at the end. One question that I've had for a while, and I guess other people have as well, is like, we have this massive crisis. Like for a lot of people, it's probably too late now to do anything about it, but it's a huge crisis. So why are we not rising up about it? And a lot of theories about civil resistance in the climate sphere say we need mass disruptive action to actually generate change. So why not? Well, I don't have an answer, but those are the questions that I think about. I do worry about surveillance, so preemptive detainment of protesters before they engage in action, and the lack of transparency about the surveillance that any of us, you or me, could be under right now, and how it quashes activism in a way that means the state doesn't have to use violence they can achieve all their goals to repress protests without using any violence at all. So I think surveillance really matters. And also, groups really depend on money, and you don't get money, grant funding, unless you obey the laws of the land. Last slide, research on non-violent climate protests. So we have a really big project on Emma mentioned, which is funded by the Sunrise Project, which is a climate organisation here in Australia, and it's managed by the Common Social Change Library. And we're looking at, well, basically collecting all the data we can on groups, campaigns, activities, media responses, arrests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a limit to what we can actually get and analyse like immediately. But next year, our stage 2 is we want to look more closely, we want to really try to get this data on criminalisation of protests. There's a lot of other groups that are doing really great work on this, but there's no centralised database on how many people are getting move-on orders, how many people are at a protest and the police arrive and they're not being arrested, or how many people are being taken to the watch house and then released, and what are the demographics of those people that really, really matter. We want to look at that. And then the second thing, we're up to about 2,000 campaigns in our database, and we really want to know the outcomes of all of them, because it takes ages to figure it out. So then we can actually start getting this massive database, do some statistical analysis, and really start answering those questions. What sort of tactic and what sort of campaign by what sort of group works under which sort of context at what time, and how does that change? You just need lots of data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. I'm Winifred Lewis, for those that don't know me. And for those that don't know PEPSS, what we're going to do now is invite Stellan to reflect on Robin's talk for 5 to 10 minutes, and then Robin to reflect on Stellan's talk for 5 to 10 minutes. And really, we're not looking for people to say, wow, that was awesome, although that naturally would flow in both cases. What great talks, both of you. But just to think about the assumptions, the discipline, to draw out some of the things that are, to surface some of the assumptions and to draw out some of the themes that strike you as people working in very different ways. And I'm glad to start with you, Stellan, because with your long experience, multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary and multi-context, I'm sure you can offer some great thoughts. So can I ask you to keep to that 5-minute mark, and then the extra 5 minutes is for enthusiasm. And then Robin, you'll do the same, and then we'll finally allow the people in the room and online to ask questions. Go ahead, Stellan.
Thank you very much. Yes. Okay. I'll try to keep to the time. So I think it's very helpful to have these forms of statistics, particularly when they are broken down into different time periods and different actors, different types of responses. I think that's very helpful in order to develop theories and understanding of trends, and to figure out why do we find certain developments in certain parts of, for example, in this case, Australia. I think it's kind of helpful, but we need to combine that kind of statistics, I think, with conceptual development and case studies. Otherwise, it becomes very hard to really interpret what we're talking about. Let me give a couple of examples here. I think that what we mean with violence is a very important question. I think there's a huge difference between the violence against objects, which I personally wouldn't really count as violence at all, and violence against people. So my question is then, how do we regard sabotage, which is probably going to be a key feature of the climate movement in future, because we see so little of response from the political establishment on the climate crisis? Sabotage is going to happen much more. I think it can be done in ways that are not endangering people, and in that way it shouldn't be branded as violence. I remember an article that I saw in Mobilization, one of the biggest social movements studies, that was looking at the violence of the terror of the animal rights movement. The irony of that article was that there was not one single case of the animal rights movement actually killing or hurting an individual person. But still, they were framed as being terrorists because they were destroying property. I think we should avoid that kind of very repressive surveillance language. So that's one problem I have. Another thing is that we find that riots are combined very often with unarmed movements historically. So Benjamin Case did a dissertation looking at the cases that Erika Chenoweth has been looking at as the very famous successful unarmed or non-violent movements, and showing that major riots were also part of these unarmed movements historically, even in the Gandhian struggle in India. So that is also an issue that I think needs to be reflected upon. And I'm glad to see that there is this comparison between Hong Kong and Australia, because another thing that I think is really incredibly important here is the context of how people read what is happening. What is seen as legitimate or supported by populations are very different in different contexts. In Sweden, if you where I come from, if you smash a window, people get very upset and you have really trouble to get support for your movement. But smashing a window or doing destruction to property is a normal thing in Latin America in unarmed movements, and they are widely supported by the general population when they are reacting to broader social injustices, and they're not seen as being violent movements because they destroy windows or so. So context matters here a lot. And another point that I'm thinking of is the importance of putting in here the trend of legal repression against movements that is happening in Australia, UK, France, Sweden, United States, where ordinary non-violent civil disobedience are often branded as being extremist, is branded as being some form of close environment to terrorism. That's a changed discourse from the state and part of the lawfare against ordinary unarmed resistance. So I think we need to put that into the dynamic here and not just look at the movements of what they're doing, but the changed context in terms of the increasing legal repression against ordinary non-violent civil disobedience, if you see what I mean. So that's a couple of things where I think that we need to engage, and I hope that the movement monitor people are engaging into this qualitative interpretation of the data as well, because the statistics in themselves is in not giving the answers, I think. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Stellan, for those reflections. And I'm now going to ask Robin to spend a few minutes in that five-minute range to reflect on Stellan's talk and how you see that body of work more broadly.
Okay. Yeah, I really enjoy the talk, especially breaking things down into numbers. I love that when there's certain types of nonviolent resistance and then 9 types of other things. I think that's wonderful. My response to that would be that as someone who's heavy in the data, it's really great. And the reason why we want to collect all this data is to try applying it to these theories. There's a wealth of social research movement, right? Years and years of it, so many theories, but you need data to actually apply to them to see if they work. The problem when we have different theories, you have to recode it all. I'm being very tedious here, but when you want to try matching it against this theory versus that theory, you have to go and recode all your data. So there's really big constraints, as Stellan mentioned, to actually applied research in this field. I also was really interested in everyday resistance. So there's a lot of everyday resistance with climate. Maybe you could argue that private pro-environmental behaviours like putting solar panels on your roof is everyday resistance, right? I don't know. I mean, I'm really interested in what Stellan was saying about that. I wonder about the efficacy of it. A really big problem with climate change is that one person doing one thing is meaningless. We need fossil fuels companies to stop, right? We need to make it stop now. And you can't do that through everyday resistance. Now, things like maybe community energy projects, when they're bringing in new batteries for your own suburb and you're kind of going off the grid, totally away from fossil fuels. Maybe that could be effective, but we need a grid too. So I'm really interested in how everyday resistance could apply to the climate movement and how I can get data on it. The last thing I want to mention is about sabotage. Now, I have thought about this a lot, right? In America, there is a very strong history of the monkey wrench gang and some definite violence against property, against objects in the service of environmental issues, particularly logging. And look, there has been some cases here, but this is a feeling. I probably shouldn't mention in a research talk, but it feels like there's a very strong norm against any sabotage here. Even those really extreme protests we've had, say up on the Carmichael coal mine where there was a blockade camp for years, and now down in Sydney, they've never sabotaged something. And you could argue that maybe because we know it's kind of ineffective, right? When you think about Just Stop Oil, it's a really well-known group in the UK now. They had a talk, and I went to the talk, and the person was expressing quite a bit of irritation because people would always say to them, why are you stopping people on the street? This is the same argument against Extinction Rebellion. Why are you stopping people on the street rather than blockading a oil refinery? They've been doing that for years. So what's the difference? They get no media coverage. They get immediately removed from those refineries. But if they throw soup at a painting, they get millions of media hits. Again, it's debatable if that's a pro or a con, but the outcome is so radically different that maybe sabotage is not going to happen here, but those more stunty type things will develop. It's hard to know what's going to happen with climate. Like I said, I worry as well that people have got to the point they know it's too late. They're kind of why bother doing anything? That is a concern for me. So on the whole, I found Stellan's talk. Thank you so much. Really interesting. And I would love to have another 24 months of time so I could apply our data to your theory.
Well done. Before we go to questions, I just want to ask everyone to applaud our two speakers for those thoughtful and fascinating reflections. So I want to orient everyone to our time. We've got 22 minutes, and our tradition is that we will start with a student question, whether that's online or in the room. So we're now going to have a bit of a pause while we wait for a student to become brave enough to raise their hands. And I just encourage you to be that person. In a talk on resistance, resist the norm. Give voice to your questions. Oh, well done.
This question is for Stellan.
I'll repeat it as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think about 12 or 13 hours ago, the UK government released a new definition of extremism. So there are three components that they look at: hatred, violence, and intolerance. I'm kind of wondering if maybe you have any thoughts about the intolerance footnote. So that's footnote 8, I think, in their document. So it's a fresh document that I was reading, and
just to clarify, Stellan's not from a UK context. He's in the US and Sweden, but I think we all can riff about the criminalization of protest as evil. Stellan, your thoughts? Oh, sorry. I said I would repeat it, and then I was caught up in the question.
No.
The question was, what are your thoughts on the
fine.
recent UK? Oh, you heard it okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
Thank you. Firstly, I think we need to see that new legislation in the UK as part of a UK trend and a part of a trend within liberal democracies, as I mentioned, in Sweden, France, UK, Australia, United States, of having more repressive legislation against forms of protest that has previously been regarded to be acceptable and even applauded. And it's also part of, in my understanding, although I haven't read carefully the new proposal in UK, but as far as I understand, very much targeted against Muslim opposition within the UK. And I find that to be very problematic. Obviously, we don't want a civil society filled of hate, violence, and intolerance. But what kind of hate, violence, and intolerance aren't we seeing from the UK government against migrants, against Palestinians, against Muslim populations within UK? So it becomes a part of a tool, I think, in a battle that is very problematic. And so for me, the question becomes like, what do we do about that? And I think it's very much a matter of forming alliances between different social groups in society. And it's a matter of also being creative in developing forms of humor, in forms of creative protest where people can show another form of unity. How? I can't say right now, but I think it's a part of a discourse where protesters are framed nowadays as being a threat to society, a security threat, which is a very problematic trend.
Yeah, that's very important and interesting point. Robin, did you want to reflect on it? I think you.
Very quickly, Winifred and Kelly and I wrote a paper about this, and another person called Robin Banks, Dr. Robin Banks, in Australia. And yeah, there's three methods they use to criminalise protesters. They dehumanise them, call them feral eco-terrorists, right? And then they use discretionary powers. So these are the move-on orders I was talking about, getting people out of a space by giving them a fine for potentially having alcohol, clearing the things about some laws that don't allow you to have just a thing in a space, so they can move you on for that, or arresting you, making an activity actually criminal. So there's research on it going on, but it's very, very hard to get the data to underpin your arguments.
Yeah. And hard to theorize, right? Like, I think my approach, and probably Robin would say the same, is that we would think of the state actors as collective actors. Therefore, they have identities and norms. And we see a dynamic of mutual radicalization. That's part of the kind of ambiguity of the benefits of norm violation. And we've all been talking about that and thinking about it. It's on the one hand, there can be some benefits. On the other hand, there can be alienation and radicalization of the state. And escalating repression is a form of that. But the good thing about, approaching the movement, approaching the state as an ecosystem rather than an entity, is it does open the door to psychology of divide and conquer and the psychology of growing coalitions, as Stellan's language or alliances, your language alluded to. So I think that's the way forward against repression. And part of what I interpret Stellan's point about using humor and using protests that are creative, that allow people to show unity, is that you create these kind of ripple signals, and that can be a benefit of private everyday resistance as well, where we're all showing each other, we're going to retweet Winnie the Pooh in China, and we're all showing each other what we think. And then that allows a group to form, and that allows an identity to form that can then become the basis for an emergent action later. But the part where they gun down protesters in the street is something that I feel unequipped to engage. And I don't think there's many people that have engaged it successfully. I agree with you, Stellan, about your critique of the Chenoweth data, although I think the main point of the Chenoweth data, which for those of you that don't know, she was the scholar that showed the power of nonviolent resistance. I think that's an absolutely essential headline to communicate. But now, as everyone tries to unpack the next step and to deal with those contexts, whether it's Hong Kong or Russia or Ukraine, where there are guns and bodies lying everywhere, I think we need to think about the psychology of violence and war and the context of collective atrocities. And I guess I'll stop talking. Sorry, I'm getting excited. But I do think that's that work with Unica that some of you know in Indonesia and the work with Annie Pullman, torture in Indonesia, that is a direction our lab is trying to go, is to look at repression and the psychology of state actors using violence. All right, let's go to other questions. Yep, go ahead. I'm looking at you yeah, you just move your hand and I'm going to zoom in on you. Yes.
I have lots of questions, but I'm going to try and narrow it down. I really appreciated both of your talks, but my question is for Robin, and it's related a little bit to, as two parts, like how has your data reflected the fact that direct action has been commonly, regularly designed to, like, for arrest, for an outcome of arrest, and also how does the design of action, is it changing so that it's more wanting to reach the media over disruption? Like, is it prioritizing media time over disruption?
Yeah, and so Stellan, the question was about, how do we understand that dynamic where activists plan a tactic that will get them arrested with an eye to perhaps media attention? Robin?
Well, I suppose it's complicated, right? Because I wouldn't say there's necessarily many actions that I have seen in our very big database that actually say we're doing this because we want to be arrested. Now, there's definitely some groups that have used actions that are associated with arrest. And of course, that's Extinction Rebellion or Fireproof or Blockade Australia here in Australia. But I would say that it wasn't necessarily arrest per se. It's usually for media. The whole point is we're raising awareness about the climate crisis. So the media is the avenue to do that. And unfortunately, all of our data shows the best way you get media attention is by doing something really novel, really offensive, and really unexpected. That's why Extinction Rebellion 2019 got so much coverage. So groups have used direct action on climate for at least 30 years. Greenpeace started in the 90s, I think, doing some climate-related direct action. And overall, it's very hard often to work out, I'll wrap up soon, but very hard to work out what the point of these actions are. Sometimes we overestimate how much people in a group sit down and think about what the point of their tactics are.
Yeah.
Often tactics are just chosen because A, they're easy to do, or there's a bunch of people who are excited about it, or someone else has come in, co-opted the group and said, I want to glue myself to the road. So you can overthink the point of why they choose these tactics. But the last thing would be that most direct action that I personally have been involved in has not been for media, it's not been for arrests, it's been very specifically targeted, say, at a politician, because they sit in a politician's office. So whether they get media or not, whether they get arrested or not was irrelevant. It's more they want to sit in the office of a politician and say, we're not going away. But again, it's all conjecture for most of these tactics. Ellen?
Did you want to comment on that, Stellan?
Well, no, I think that there is a particular logic that might be for certain occasions the value of people risking arrest because it shows a form of commitment. Particularly if you have massive numbers of people that are risking, it can be powerful. But I think there is a problem with movements that are trying to mainly get media coverage and media headlines from their actions, which is, with time, when you repeat the same kind of actions, it tends to be less effective. Less getting attention. So that's also why I am emphasizing other more creative forms like constructive resistance, where you're building up alternatives at the same time as you do resistance. It becomes effective even if you don't get arrested, even if you don't get media attention. I think that's the only thing I want to add. Otherwise,
Yeah,
I
and a
agree.
really important point. Thank you, Stella. Other questions online? If you're online, please raise your hand in the Zoom, because otherwise there's quite a few people I'm not able to see at present. As we're centering Stellan on our screen here, only a handful of others are seeing questions. Kel?
Yeah, my question is for Stellan. I'm wondering, what do you think is the relationship between people who engage in individual level everyday resistance to more group level prefigurative politics, or even just mass demonstrations? I don't think you really touched on that.
I think you could hear that, Stellan. You're nodding. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, that's extremely important. We know very little about that kind of dynamic, but we know a couple of things. We know that in periods when we don't see mass resistance, we can find that people are still doing resistance that are more individualized. So in more repressive situations, when it's too dangerous or there isn't like circumstances for a mass movement to emerge, people do individual resistance, more everyday forms of resistance. So in that way, it paves the way towards a situation that opens up, maybe with a crisis for the regime when there is a sudden eruption of mass protest. So in that way, you can say that there is a connection. There is also this connection that I think that we can see how people that are doing protest tend to be over time frustrated with the problems of getting results. Like in the US, we have seen the biggest protests in the history of the United States with the Women's March and the Black Liberation protests that produced very, very little of results. And that makes people turn more towards prefiguration, towards how can we create the alternatives ourselves. I think for me then the issue is to continue to keep the connection between the individualized and the collective resistance and the prefiguration, to not kind of believe that there is only one tactic, one form of resistance that is going to solve it all. I hope that makes sense. But we need to research more the connections here to know more about the dynamics between individual and group and prefiguration. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I guess I would comment, I see a lot of everyday resistance as collective. So an example, like there are so many examples in every repressive society, but you know, when if you're retweeting the Winnie the Pooh in China, or using code words, what you're doing is making visible to others as well your defiance and your collective defiance. So not all everyday resistance is individual. Other questions? There was one. Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much, both of you. I have a question for Robin, I think, which encompasses some of the things that both of you talked about. And I asked this as an activist researcher, and I wanted to kind of bring back that conversation about the ethical problems when it comes to conducting activist research. And I know maybe this varies when we're talking about qualitative versus quantitative data, but in your research, Robin, how have you navigated, protecting the interests of activists, or protecting perhaps the identities, the tactics, and the safety even of activists who participate in research projects, as well as perhaps mediating that what Stellan was talking about with the reformist intentions of the state, and the fact that the state and other institutions can and very much do weaponize academic knowledge production for their own interests. So how do we steer clear from that knowledge production? And even things like the movement monitor, is there any concern that could be weaponized and used against activists? And how do we maintain that these types of outputs can actually benefit activists? And how are they maybe integrated in those collaborative projects as well? That's a big question, so we can talk about it later as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. It can be, I would say the biggest challenge to navigate is simply when explaining what you think about something, like me right now. splitting out what I know from research and what I know from my personal experience. I don't believe the research environment is a place to talk about personal experience, but it's very hard not to do. That's the first thing. The way I would protect the activists or anybody that I talk to or get data from qualitatively or quantitatively is by getting ethics through university. So all data that is qualitative or quantitative goes through ethics approval. That can be high level or often low and editable lists. So it means no identification. That's a good standard procedure. In terms of the stuff we get from Movement Monitor, this is all publicly available information. So we just have spent a lot of time getting it. Now, there is a live question about could it be weaponized? And sometimes I think it is a debate that we're having, but if it's weaponized, they're already weaponizing it. They're already surveilling people and they already know it. B, often the opponents are not as well organised as what we think they are. And if they know that perhaps Group X is having a really high rate of achieving their campaigns and doing some direct action tactics, well, they're not going to change anything they do accordingly. Maybe they'll surveil them more, but they probably already are. These groups are quite happy to publicise pretty much everything they're doing. So we put that public stuff on there. How we frame it is going to be difficult. We're working through that now. But we will have the public stuff about what the movement's doing. We don't put data about events. So there's 81,000 Facebook events. We do not make that public, but we will report on the results because that is it took a long time to get. But we will also have data that goes specifically to funders. So like philanthropists want to know what groups are getting how much money and what the outcomes of those activities of those groups. We do that privately. It's kind of a balance. But yeah, really happy to talk about it afterwards as well, because it is a live thing when we come to do our first report for the Movement Monitor in June. What are we going to say?
I guess I would also add that this is an area of learning and my own learning has changed. And over time, I've become more aware of the extent to which, state actors are interested in my research and surveilling my participants and monitoring my data collection. And I guess how I would see that is in part through trying to moving away from online data collection in the sense of individuals who are disclosing, because that's very easy to surveil. And I also would echo Robin's point that in a lot of cases, if we might be the only ones that don't know what's working and not working. Sometimes publicizing what's not working is really important. Like as a scholar activist, I actually think many activists underestimate the incredible value of knowing what doesn't work. It's only by knowing what doesn't work that we can stop doing it and move to the next thing. And I feel like oftentimes it's activists that don't have that insight. The fact that the Murdoch Press is retweeting Extinction Rebellion or giving them thousands of words of coverage is suggestive to me of what they think the effect of that is. And it's not just to sell their own papers, in my view. Stellan, did you want to comment on that? We've got 1 minute left.
Super brief. I very much agree. I think that we have to be clear that there's an extensive research being done by repressive governments in trying to figure out how to deal with resistance. That's already happening. So I think it's a matter of providing a repertoire of different tactics and the tools of how to be creative with it and in your context. And then I think activists can develop their own ways of doing things. And it's only when we are thinking in terms of that there are one or two secret, very kind of magic ways of doing things that if we reveal it, it will be something that will be used by the repressive forces that they didn't have before. I don't think it is like that. I think it's more a matter of creativity, having a repertoire, understanding the toolbox of what we can do, and rely on that activists are creative enough to develop that. I also saw that there's a question in the chat. I don't know, maybe we don't have the time for that, but
I don't see anyone outside, but I am conscious some people might have to leave. I'm sorry, Sue, that there was a glitch that you couldn't raise your hand. But I actually agree it's exciting to think about examples of collective resistance, and I draw everyone's attention to featured on the screen there, the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. Did you want to just name one or two groups that you think Sue could have a look at, Stellan, if any come to mind?
Yes, I would very much encourage to look into the landless workers in Brazil, the MST. They are a movement that is about 3 million people that are active in Brazil. They occupy land and thereby resisting, but they also create a new form of life with democracy, governance, ecological farming, socialist cooperatives on the occupied land. So they construct and they resist at the same time. So that's one example.
Great. We're going to have to log off now, Zoomers, and some of us are going for lunch. So if you're in the room and you want to mill around and ask Robin more questions, you're able to do that. But before we go, please join me in thanking Stellan and Robin for their time and their expertise.
Thank you. Good luck with the work.
Oh, it's lovely to see some praise in the chat. I'll just let that run for a minute or two, Stellan, and you may like to bask in the thank yous and the congratulations and the waving hands.
Thank you so much for the invitation also.
It's such a pleasure. And I should say thank you to Hema, who ably chaired this session and whose genius idea it was. Hema's now going to be working on drawing together the insights of both speakers into one brilliant interdisciplinary manuscript, which will shortly be published. And just email Hema so that you can get a copy when it's drafted. Okay.
Excellent.
I'm going to log off now. Thanks again, everyone online.
Thank you.
We really
thank you, Hema.